Well, welcome to let's see, we're on week 21 here of our reading the Bible. We've been off for 2 weeks here, so picking up where we left off. But it has been appropriate because it's taken 2 weeks to read the book of the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah is one of those major prophets because he's got such a big book, but as we've kind of hinted with the prophets, it's good to know which kingdom he's writing to. And Isaiah is writing to the northern kingdom. It's at a time near to when Israel goes into exile. So you get those stories of how God is warning the people, what are the consequences of their not heeding the warning, and what is the hope to come. So these last 2 weeks have been an opportunity to read through that story and the many promises. And I'm sure you ran across some very familiar texts like comfort my people, the idea of preparing the feast for the people. And in particular, around 53, 54, in that area towards the end of the second book of Isaiah is the suffering servant, which is used and during Lent and especially in Holy Week as a reminder to us of why it is that Jesus had to suffer for our sins. So Isaiah speaks to that community of Jerusalem, of Judah. And it's appropriate that as we were reading along Isaiah, we were reading many of Paul's letters to communities, to churches he started. And I noticed a couple times echoes between Isaiah and Paul as he tried to help people to understand how this promise that Isaiah spoke had been fulfilled in Jesus and why he had to suffer and such. So especially as he talked to the Galatians, the Ephesians, the Philippians, the Colossians, and the Thessalonians, it worked out very nicely that we were talking to those communities while we were listening to Isaiah. And I don't know if you noticed as you read the letters of Paul, but how different issues, but yet similar issues are addressed. And especially as you go through those single letters, how Paul's understanding changes, how his ability to explain and deepen is changed as he continues to write these letters and struggle with his own faith. And especially when you get to Colossians, because it's thought Colossians is probably the earliest letter. So Colossians to me felt a little bit like it was raw material. It was a little bit awkward and not focused for that very reason, that this was an early letter with Paul himself still trying to figure out how to explain this. And then I found it really kind of fun with Thessalonians, as I believe is also another earlier letter. And you have two letters there. So you have one letter where Paul tells everything, and then a follow-up letter to kind of respond to reactions from the people to not understanding what he meant in the first letter. So it's been kind of fun, I think, the last 2 weeks to be reading those two in tandem. So now for the next 2 weeks here, we have the prophet Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is kind of, again, he's a contemporary of Isaiah, but he's got access, a little bit closer access to the king, and has that kind of life, that call story from the very womb. And you kind of get this feeling that Jeremiah is a man having to stand by himself. And it's interesting that we'll be reading Paul's letters to many individuals. So again, you'll get that reflection of how is it that Jeremiah is able to stand up as God's true prophet in the face of many false teachers and other false prophets, and why it is that his message rings so differently. And often it is because his message is countercultural, kind of notice that. And again, how are people doing worship? How are people living their lives in a way that says they believe this stuff? And you'll see that same sort of thing in Paul's letters to Timothy, to Titus, to Philemon, and then later on to the Hebrews, to the Hebrew people. We'll get into that next week. But in particular, I just, as you get to the end, you'll get to Philemon, and imagine this is a very short letter, and it is delivered by the man who is being talked about in the letter, Onesimus. So I think I see that one as one of the most beautiful examples of a healthy triangle, shall we say, of someone advocating for another person to create and mend a relationship. So do have fun with Jeremiah this week and next week. And as you begin to read about 1 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, think of Paul speaking to you and how it is that you are to live out your faith. We'll talk to you next week. Have fun reading.